The classical period of Greek history is characterized by greater artistic skill in depicting lifelike forms, though there is still a preference for idealizing subjects, making all the people look beautiful. Here we see a red figure vase that depicts the mythical hero Odysseus listening to the Song of the Sirens. Greece's first major protracted engagement with a foreign power is what is treated as the transitional mark from the archaic to classical period. The Persian Empire was a vast territory governed by glorified feudal barons called satraps, who sent tax money and soldiers to the high Persian king, whose official title was Shah Hashah, or the King of Kings. This empire was established by the first Persian king, Cyrus the Great, and when Persia's wars with Greece began, Persia was ruled by Cyrus's grandson, Darius or Darius. By the beginning of the 5th century BCE, the Persian Empire came to stretch to the coast of Asia Minor, modern Turkey. This means that the Greek colonies of Ionia were subject to Persia. The Greek mainland gets involved when Ionia attempted to revolt from Persia. The revolt was crushed, and Persia rule of Ionia was reestablished. The problem for Greece was that the Greek king, or rather the Greek city of Athens, had sent ships to aid the revolt of the Ionians, who were their distant relatives. After all, the Ionian colony supposedly was sent out from Athens. The Persians found out that Athens had sent material to Ionia. King Darius decided to invade Athens and annex it to his own empire to make an example of the Athenians. We know a lot more about the Persian Wars than about previous Greek history because the first great Greek historian, Herodotus, wrote his book, The Histories, about the Persian Wars specifically. The result of Darius's invasion is the famous Battle of Marathon. 10,000 Athenian hoplites, or soldiers, met in a line against many times more Persians, and yet they won. They did this with what in tactics is called a defensive envelopment. Since the Athenians were outnumbered, they were afraid that the Persians would be able to outflank or surround them just by stretching the line of men longer than the line of Athenian men. The Athenians met this challenge by thinning the middle of their phalanx, or battle line. With fewer men in the middle, they were able to stretch their line out to avoid being outflanked. This was a good idea for the Athenians on the flanks, or the edges of the line, but the Athenians in the center were still vulnerable, much more vulnerable actually. When the two armies met, the Persians predictably broke through the middle of the Athenian line. However, the Persians poured in through the middle too eagerly, and so the Athenians on the flanks were able to close in around the Persians in a pincer and create a killing field. The Persians who were not slaughtered fled back to their ships and sailed away. Athens was saved, for the moment at least. It was 10 years before the Persians returned. During that time, the Athenians made some very important preparations. Athens' main source of wealth was a network of silver mines to the south of the city, and a rich vein of metal was discovered not too long after Marathon. By this time, Athens was a democracy, and any Athenian man could propose a motion and vote on laws in the assembly. This made forming policy over what to do with a lot of money that had suddenly appeared virtually out of nowhere very difficult. For a while, it looked as though the Athenians would simply mint the silver into coinage and divide it among all the male citizens. You can imagine this was a very popular proposal. However, one particularly savvy politician named Themistocles actually managed to persuade the Athenian assembly to invest the new wealth in building triremes, or warships, for the common defense of the city. It would be this decision that saved the city again, and after the Persian Wars, lay the foundations for the Athenians' brutally exploitative naval empire. 10 years after Marathon, the Persians returned, with Darius's son, King Xerxes, actually throwing the weight of the royal presence into the expedition and commanding it personally. The king's army was enormous and famously extravagant. Herodotus says there were 1 million Persian soldiers, which is literally impossible. Modern historians estimate there may have been as many as 100,000, though, which is still quite impressive. The invasion was what is called amphibious, which means that the army marched along the coast from Turkey to Greece, with a navy sailing alongside them. The fleet was important not only to counter the Greeks' ships, but also to supply the Persian army, which was so huge that it was difficult to provision it from day to day. The rocky and mountainous terrain of Greece also proved a frustration, and this became acute at the Battle of Thermopylae. The pass between the sea and the mountain was so narrow that 7,000 Greeks, led by one of the 2 Spartan kings, Leonidas, built a wall across the pass and were able to bottleneck the tens of thousands of Persians on the other side. Now, history books today often forget about this, but not all the Greeks resisted Persian invasion. Athens and Sparta led a coalition of resistors, but many Greek polis submitted to and even welcomed the Persian invaders. That is necessary to see in order to understand what happened next. A local man helped to show the Persians local paths through the mountains so that they could wind their way to get to the other side of the Greeks from behind them and surround them so that the Persians could slaughter the Greeks and break the bottleneck. Fortunately, Leonidas received word that the Persians were coming from behind him in time to dismiss the 7,000 allies, but he himself stood to fight to the death with his personal bodyguard of 300. When the Spartans were killed, the Persians were free to move forward. In a strictly technical sense, Xerxes' war was declared against Athens specifically, though everybody in Greece understood that the Persians fully intended to claim dominion over the whole of Greece in the process. When Xerxes moved on from Thermopylae then, he went on to invade Attica and sack the city of Athens. He found an empty city, because Themistocles had once again made a seemingly impossible political maneuver a reality, and he convinced the assembly to evacuate the whole city. The Athenians deposited their families on the nearby island of Salamis and fought the Persians, this time at sea. The Athenians and their allies crushed the Persian fleet by luring them into a narrow pass between the island of Salamis and the Greek mainland. When the Persian army could not have enough space to surround the Greeks ships attacked, and the Persian ships ran into and sank each other, and once again, the sheer size of the Persian fleet proved a liability. The Greek fleet at sea, the Greek victory at sea was total. And the major problem that this caused for Xerxes was that he was no longer able to feed his ridiculously huge army. The king therefore took a large number of his troops back to Persia and left a more reasonably sized army under his brother-in-law Mardonius to continue the war and try to conquer Greece. The next year, the Greek coalition defeated the remnants of the Persians at Plataea. The details of the battle are mind-bogglingly complicated, with one group making some silly decisions without knowing what was going on elsewhere on the battlefield. The important point is this: the Greeks won and expelled the Persians once and for all. The Greeks, and especially the Athenians and Spartans, had established themselves as powers demanding recognition.